Nice job, losers. And believe me, I'm not talking to the Trump team. I'm talking to the losers in the House and in the Manhattan DA's office, who are now going to have to explain themselves about why they're politically targeting the president. All right, so yesterday we had some important Supreme Court rulings on President Trump's taxes. And of course, it was painted by the panic merchants in the mainstream media. Joe, big loss for President Trump. Huge, enormous loss for President Trump. President Trump is now going to have to turn over his taxes. Oh my gosh, Pelosi won again. Now, a little background on the case before I get to the Wall Street Journal article and the Red State article, which point out, was this really a loss for President Trump? Because if you read the case and are interested again in those crazy thing called facts, you'd find out that this may have been actually a pretty big win for President Trump. Little background. The House of Representatives, run by the tyrannical police state Democrats, Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi, subpoenaed President Trump's tax returns. Now, for those of you interested in how this stuff works, the House does have subpoena power. That's clear, obviously. The House of Representatives, however, is not a law enforcement agency. Again, media people, pay attention. I'll do your show prep for you now. They are not law enforcement officers. They are congressmen or senators. The House subpoena power on the House side, they can subpoena documents from people with a legitimate legislative interest. Please understand the difference. They're not law enforcement. They can't subpoena Dan Bongino's taxes because they want to investigate me for tax fraud. However, they can subpoena my taxes if there was a case, say, against the IRS where there was an IRS reform being proposed, and one of the reforms was, say, to reduce the targeting of conservatives by the IRS. They could ask me for my taxes if it relates to the case where they're doing a legislative reform package to reform conservative targeting by the IRS. Does that make sense? It has to have a legislative purpose, not a law enforcement one. They're not a law. Now, those can cross over, but there has to be a clear legislative purpose. This had never been lined out, but forgive me for the background, but it's important understanding how the media painted the story as a Trump loss when it was really a win. That had never been clarified clearly by the Supreme Court before. It was kind of an understood handshake deal between the presidency and the Congress, right? If we want documents from the president, we can subpoena them, but it has to be for a legitimate legislative purpose. There'll be some back and forth, but eventually there'll be a deal worked out. Everybody clear on that? It was never clearly delineated by the Supreme Court. Well, no more, because of course, the House of Representatives, run by the hapless Nancy Pelosi, who keeps getting wrecked by Donald Trump at every opportunity, whether it be impeachment, her collusion hoax, or elsewhere, Pelosi and Schiff decided, well, let's just take this case to the Supreme Court because we're demanding Trump's taxes. And even though we have no legislative goal here whatsoever, other than to harass Donald Trump with a fake case and another hoax, we're going to get those damn taxes anyway. So what happened yesterday in the courts? It's a little complicated, but in a 7-2 majority, Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. They remanded the case back to the lower courts and said, there were two cases, one about the New York taxes, which the contours are roughly the same. But I'm just talking about the case where Nancy Pelosi wanted Trump's tax returns. They remanded the case down to the lower courts. They didn't prevent them from getting Trump's taxes. So, Joe, the media story was, big win, Nancy Pelosi. Trump doesn't get to hide his taxes. But that's not exactly what happened.
Right.
They remanded the case back to the lower courts and said, if you want said taxes, you're now going to have to meet some conditions. Oh no, you didn't hear about that on the media, did you? No, they avoided that because they wanted to make it out like Pelosi won when Pelosi actually got the palm to the face. Let's go to the Wall Street Journal article, which covers this quite well. Remember, it's called a Supreme Loser by the great Kimberly Strassel, a seriously terrific writer. Supreme Loser, Pelosi's house. Pelosi's house lost it? What are you talking about? I thought we heard in the media that the Supreme Court told Trump, give us those taxes. Of course, you listen to the media. I'm very sorry. You heard wrong. Here's what actually happened. Let's go to the first part of this. He says, writing for the 7-2 majority, Chief Justice John Roberts took note of the House's unrestrained behavior, explaining this dispute was the first of its kind. In other words, Joe, this had never happened before. These losers typically work it out before it reaches the Supreme Court. He says, listen, for 2 centuries, they've just worked it out. Of course, Pelosi and her losers didn't want to work it out. So she says, yes, the court held that Congress can continue pushing for its subpoena in the lower courts. But henceforth, Joe, all courts will be required to subject all subpoenas now to several tests. Wait. So just to be clear, the media said Trump got smoked yesterday. Oh my gosh, it was so bad. Pelosi, big winner. Nice job. So before this Supreme Court ruling, there were no strict tests. There was a suggestion that it was due to a legislative authority, but there were no strict tests. Now, Pelosi gets remanded to a lower court. Now she has to meet 4 criteria she didn't have to meet before. How exactly was that a win? Please, again, I'm just asking for facts for my liberal viewers and listeners out there. How exactly did Pelosi, she doesn't have his tax returns, and now she has to go back to court to get them, and now she has to meet 4 criteria she didn't have to meet just before yesterday. So, sounds like a big win to me for Trump. Dan, you're a Trump supporter. You're just putting lipstick on a pig here. Yep. No, I'm just telling you the facts. Prior to yesterday, Pelosi didn't have to meet criteria. She now has to go back to court to meet now. How is that a win? The brilliant Kimberly Strassel, again, from her piece. This surprised you. For starters, now lawmakers will have to show that they need the president's papers specifically to fulfill a legislative purpose. Quote from John Roberts, Congress may not rely on the president's information if other sources could reasonably provide Congress the information it needs. That's test 1. They didn't have to meet yesterday, which they now have to meet today. Roberts also writes, courts must also now insist on a subpoena that is, quote, no broader than reasonably necessary to support Congress's legislative objective. Criteria number 2, Pelosi will now have to meet. She did not have to meet yesterday in her big win, air quotes. The subpoenas must also provide detailed, Joe, and substantial evidence of said legislative purpose. And finally, courts must from now on specifically assess the burdens imposed on the president by the subpoena because they come from a rival political branch, which could use them for, quote, institutional advantage. Please, again, folks, please, I'm begging you to explain to me in common sense, coherent sentences Joe Biden couldn't formulate right now how this was a win for Pelosi. None of these criteria, obstacles, existed before her lawsuit that exists now. She still doesn't have Trump's taxes. And now they have to go back to court with new obstacles they didn't have before yesterday. This was the big win for the Dems. Again, if you watch CNN and MSNBC, you were told Trump got smoked. He's not going to be able to go to the U.S. Open this year. He caught it right in the caboose. Someone kicked him right in his backside. He really lost. He dropped the L. Loser. Except for the fact that none of the actual facts comport with that analysis, which is utterly absurd. Now, because that Wall Street Journal piece is behind a paywall, I included another piece in the show notes from Red State, which is fantastic. It's long, but if you really want to understand what happened yesterday, read this gem. It's really, really good by our friends, Shipwreck crew at Red State. Chief Justice Roberts gives President Trump 2 wins in subpoena cases for reasons not obvious at first glance. As you can see, this will be up in the show notes, this piece. I strongly encourage you to read it. The show notes are available at bongino.com/newsletter. From the Red State piece, read this. It's long, but it just explains exactly what I just told you. That even in the Manhattan case, any of these efforts now are going to end up in federal court with the state or local prosecutor now having to run a gauntlet of tests that the Supreme Court suggested could warrant federal intervention in order to protect the institution of the presidency. In other words, doubling down on exactly what Kim Strassel said. You didn't win anything. Now to get his tax returns, you have to go back to court and run a gauntlet of tests you didn't have to do just a week ago. Nice job, losers. And believe me, I'm not talking to the Trump team. I'm talking to the losers in the House and in the Manhattan DA's office, who are now going to have to explain themselves about why they're politically targeting the president.
You just heard Dan Bongino.